Welcome back to Advanced Strategy and Analytics. This is the second lecture in our course, and we will be going over professional slide design. This lecture is going to start off by going over a general overview of slide decks. Then it's going to get into how to properly structure a deck, followed by the mechanisms and getting into more granular detail about how to build out a slide, followed up by general tips and professionalism, and then we'll end off by talking about advanced graphs. In this first section, we're going to go over slide deck use cases as well as different types of slide decks. You're going to learn a lot of really cool data skills throughout this course. However, the ability to build effective slide decks is probably the most valuable skill that you will take away from this course simply because of how ubiquitous slide decks are. We live in a world of humans. We rely on one another for society to function. And in order for us to rely on one another, we have to communicate with one another to be able to get what we want and to trade and to do business. One of the most common mediums in our modern world for us to communicate with one another is slide decks, simply because they are very effective of combining both graphical and textual data in order to communicate messages amongst a broad or specific audience. Slide decks have many applications outside of business. The military uses slide decks for staff and for status briefings on operations. In the political realm, slide decks are used to inform politicians on current world events. They're also used for policy procedures and to present research findings. Even in the nonprofit area, they're used to help to rally people to a cause, to be able to get funding, or even in church communities, they're used to train leadership. Slide decks have a vast application and can be used in almost any aspect of life. I would just like to stress, it doesn't matter how good you are at doing data analysis. If you are not able to communicate your analysis, if you're not able to present it in a way that is easy to follow, that is convincing, that tells a story, or if you at least do not have somebody else that will do it for you, your analysis is worth nothing without it. That is why this is one of the first lectures in this course. So I've seen two main types of presentations, and I am just going to give them names of narrative decks and stakeholder decks. So I think narrative decks are what we are most familiar with. Narrative decks are presentations that present general information to a broad audience. They try to create a lot of engagement. They try to be very inspiring. So that is one type of deck that I've seen, and that is usually what the most of us were taught how to do in school. The other type of deck, and I've seen this a lot more in professional settings, is what I'm going to call stakeholder decks. Now, stakeholder decks are very different than narrative decks. They present very targeted information to a specific audience. They're usually very to the point, and they are centered around helping the viewer be able to take in and digest as much information as possible. Usually you do not learn about how to make these types of decks until you actually go out into into a corporate setting and gain real world experience. So both of these decks in their specific use cases are appropriate. However, for most professional situations, you will want to default with using a stakeholder deck type approach. Um, just really quick, some common examples of narrative decks include TED Talks, trade shows, presentations, so on, while stakeholder decks, usually you'll see them more as, say, like consulting presentations, funding pitches, internal reports, or project proposals. Some good rules of thumb that I like to use to figure out whether or not I would be presenting a narrative style deck or a stakeholder style deck is I ask myself, well, first, where am I presenting it? If I'm presenting in a large auditorium room in front of a lot of people, well, with the lights off, then I'm probably presenting a narrative deck. However, if I'm presenting a deck inside a meeting room and there's a limited number of people there and I usually know exactly who is going to be in that meeting, more often than not, I am presenting a stakeholder deck. Now, I will say about 90% of the time, you are probably going to be presenting a stakeholder deck. Um, and also just, I think in general, it's more safer to present stakeholder decks just because in the case that you present a stakeholder deck to more of a narrative deck type audience, the worst case scenario is you're just going to bore the audience. However, if you end up presenting a narrative deck to a stakeholder deck audience, you can get kicked out of meetings for doing this. So I highly recommend that you learn how to create stakeholder decks. One thing I do want to touch on before we move on to the next slide is just the intrinsic value of stakeholder decks versus narrative decks. I want you to think about the most amazing presentation you've ever seen, the best TED Talk ever, the best narrative slide deck presentation that you've ever witnessed. I want you to ask yourself, how much money would you pay for a PDF copy of that deck? Oftentimes, it really wouldn't be that much. The most I could think of is maybe 500 bucks. And the reason is the value in narrative decks is not actually in the deck, it's in the presentation. And they're not meant to have a bunch of research or analysis that is worth a lot of money stored within them. They're supposed to be emotionally moving. They're supposed to capture and engage an audience to be able to persuade, to create feeling within the audience. And you can't really capture that within a deck. So the intrinsic value of the deck itself is very low. Now, compare that to stakeholder decks. If you think about how much money do the top consulting firms sell their stakeholder decks for, it ranges on the low end from anywhere in the hundreds of thousands to the millions. And it really makes you beg the question, why would a company pay millions and millions of dollars for a PDF slide deck? And the reason must be there has to be something that justifies the company to spend that much money on one of these decks. I know here at BYU, we have a couple consulting groups that are student run that consult for companies in the area, in the local area. Those decks that the students that BYU ends up selling, the decks that BYU ends up selling out to other companies that are completely student made, even those go for thousands and thousands of dollars. And I think that really does sum up one of the key differences between a narrative deck and a stakeholder deck. If you are creating a stakeholder deck, always ask yourself the question, how much money would somebody pay for what I'm creating right now? And does my content justify that price? The biggest difference between narrative decks and stakeholder decks is that narrative decks support an oral presenter to a broad audience, while stakeholder decks are meant to stand on their own without a speaker, and they deliver very specific information to key people. In purpose, narrative decks look to inspire, they target a public audience, they try to appeal more to emotions, they use a narrative structure. Narrative structures usually focus more on taking an archetypal approach to being able to present information, presenting general truths that resonate with a wide general audience. Their content is speaker focused. All the slides are there to support the speaker. They should not distract from the speaker, so there should be minimal information on the slides. And the format is more of a theatrical setting. Again, being more focused on the speaker. Now, stakeholder decks on the other hand, their primary purpose is to inform an audience. They want to make information as easy for an audience to digest as possible. Oftentimes, stakeholder decks are used to help people come to a decision about something as well. They are targeted at a very specific audience. This could be someone like your boss, or it could be um, investors that you're trying to get in a, a round of funding, or even just a project proposal that you're trying to get through. They also tend to focus more on, they take more of a logical approach. Everything that they have is very much data backed. It's important that in stakeholder decks that you're able to, you take more of a data driven approach. They use a pyramid style format in structure rather than narrative. This means rather than building up to a thesis like a narrative would, a pyramid structure starts with the thesis first and then will continue into more granular detail. They also are deck focused, meaning that the information on the slide should be able to stand on its own without a speaker. The focus should not be on the speaker of the deck, but rather the deck itself. The speaker is just there to be able to guide the presentation. And finally, they are given in a report format, so if the deck is printed out, or if somebody looks at the deck after the presentation, they should be able to use the information on the deck to do whatever that the deck was intended to do. Now, I think like a big difference that you'll probably see between narrative decks and stakeholder decks is just how much text is used on the slide. Narrative decks tend to stay far away from using too much text. Sometimes I think I heard once the rule is, say, 7 bullet points per slide, where stakeholder decks will be very informationally heavy and will have a lot of text on it. Now, just because the slide has a lot of text on it does not mean you can just paste a paragraph of text on a slide and you're good to go. Remember, going back to the purpose of the deck is to inform an audience, and the deck should be as easy to follow as possible. For instance, if you take a look at this slide right here, you'll see that up here I have this lead line. It states the main purpose of the slide. Now, if you are in a rush, you could just read this lead line up here and then go on, and you should be good. You get your key takeaway from it. However, if you're more interested, you can then look at this deck, you can look at this slide and look how it's structured, how, okay, we have narrative over here, we have stake over here, we have different dimensions. You'd look and you'd see the different bolded words, and very quickly you can get a sense of what is the difference between a narrative deck and a stakeholder deck. However, if you see a bolded word, say like pyramid, for instance, a lot of people aren't familiar with the term pyramid structure outside the world of consulting. You might be curious about what that is, so you might actually spend the time to read the information here. And so you see the way this slide is structured, there is a lot of text on this slide, but it's structured in a way that if you really quickly take a glance at it, you should be able to get the general idea behind this slide. And if you're interested in different points of it, or you want to go into more detail, you would be able to do that. You can very easily tell that the most important information is up here. Then we have the secondary information here and with the bolded text. Finally, we have more granular detail in the smaller fonted text. And if you're really curious, you can look down at the footnotes and you can see where the sources for this information came. You can see that narrative decks I took from Steve Jobs, who is known as one of the best narrative presentation makers in history, as well as I also took for stakeholder decks, I used resources from McKinsey and Company to be able to determine what makes a stakeholder deck what they are. And McKinsey is widely renowned as one of the best deck creating management consulting firms out there. So I hope that helps clear up the difference between these decks. I encourage you as you go through your classes, as you look at different presentations, try to identify the different decks. Try to identify when you see a narrative deck and when you see a stakeholder deck. One final tip, a lot of business professionals usually get stuck in this middle ground. They take combined elements of narrative decks and stakeholder decks and without sticking to one or the other. And what ends up happening to them is they just create really boring PowerPoint presentations that don't actually have the same kind of content or depth or analytical grit that they're looking for. So figure out what type of presentation you're making and then stick to that deck style. For the rest of this lecture, we are mainly going to be talking about stakeholder decks. So in this next section, we'll be going over how to structure a slide deck. Whether you're trying to structure a single slide or an entire deck, always use the pyramid principle. The pyramid principle is a framework for how to structure messages, entailing that you provide the key information up front, and then you'll go gradually more into more granular detail as your message continues. You should first present whatever your answer or your thesis is, and then go into your assumptions, and then go into your supporting detail with it. Your key message, whatever you present, should be an entire summary of what is going to follow in the rest of your presentation. So this message, this topic up here should be a summarization of these three subtopics. And this subtopic here should be a summarization of these details. In addition, these topics should all be in the same group with each other, as well as these details down here should also be in the same group. This is a very top-down approach. This way, you get out the most critical key information up front, and then you continue on into more and more detail. If you notice the slide, for instance, you have up here the basic message, use the pyramid principle, and what the pyramid principle is. You state the most important information up front, you follow it by supporting topics, and then you go into granular detail. So that is the key message of this slide. Then if we're to move more into, if we're going to move down into supporting topics, we then look at this graph. This graphic very quickly can convey what the pyramid principle is just by looking at it. Then you see, okay, if I want to learn more about the vertical relationships, I'd read this call out. If I want to learn more about the horizontal relationships, I'd read this call out. This tells me what the key message is, and I can go into more detail about that. Then additionally, if I even want to go into more detail about what the pyramid principle is, I can then look over at these key takeaway text bullet points, and it will further tell me what is the pyramid principle. So whenever you're making a slide or a deck, or even writing a message in general, always try to follow this structure. This is the exact same structure you would use in a paragraph if you're writing a message, or or even just in a conversation. Honestly, it is really good practice to become familiar at using the pyramid principle. For instance, if you're going to try to negotiate with your boss to get a raise, you'd go up to him and you'd say, here's my key message. I should have a raise. And then I'd say, okay, these are the three reasons why I should get a raise. because I'm an outstanding employee. I've demonstrated superior leadership um, potential, and I've also been able to handle these tough situations. And then maybe if my boss is still listening, I'd go in and I'd give examples for each one of those. But this is a very powerful tool. This takes a lot of practice to be able to get right. Highly encourage you in all your writing and all your business communications, always try to use the pyramid principle. Here is a template for how to structure a presentation based off the pyramid principle. Now, this is a pretty general template, but if you follow this template, I'll guarantee that more often than not, you'll most likely be safe with your presentation that you are giving. You see, the top, we start out with having the key message. You'll start out getting out a situation, going into the complication or question, which then begs what should the solution be, and you present your solution. Then you'll support that with maybe 3 different assumptions, and each one of those assumptions will have slides that show data that support those assumptions. And you want your presentation to flow basically being here is what's going on, here's the problem, and here's my answer to the problem. Here are my assumptions that back this answer. If my assumptions are true, then my answer is true. Here is the data that shows my assumptions are true. And that is generally how your presentation is going to be laid out. Then finally, it's always best practice to talk about the implementation of your solution, any risks or mitigations that it has, and also the potential impact. Not all presentations are going to require this type of structure, especially for instance, if you are focusing more on an implementation deck rather than a problem-solving deck, then you might change this up a little bit. But in general, this is a great structure and format to follow whenever giving a presentation. The lead lines of a slide should always be a sentence that are summarizing the main takeaways of a slide. They should not just be a single word or title. Oftentimes the viewer already knows what slide they're on, but rather it's more useful to the viewer if you give a one sentence key takeaway for them to view. In addition, all your lead lines of your deck, if you strung them together, should read out like a paragraph. This is a very good way how to check the flow of a deck. For instance, I have these 3 slides over here, all talking about Walmart. Now, these were 3 slides that I created on my own specifically for the purposes of this deck. And this slide gives a situation. This slide shows the complication with Amazon coming in and they're growing market share. And then this slide gives the solution. Now, I could very easily just say situation, complication, and solution as the lead line, but that doesn't really help convey my message. By actually having sentences, if the viewer views this sentence and reads it, it is very clear what they're to take away from this slide. For instance, if we read this slide, it says Amazon's share of total consumer spending is steadily increasing and is projected to surpass Walmart by 2025 due to the growth in e-commerce sales in recent years. Okay, so look at this slide and I know right away. Okay, so the problem is Amazon is gaining market share on Walmart and is going to surpass Walmart because e-commerce is growing. This is a problem and it begs the question, what should Walmart do to be able to combat that? I don't need to say this is the problem on this slide because it's very clear to the viewer that this is the problem at hand. And logically, my next slide should be a solution to that problem. If we take all these lead lines and we put them together, watch how it reads. As of 2021, Walmart is the leader in retail sales and has experienced high growth in its e-commerce sales. However, Amazon's share of total consumer spending is steadily increasing and is projected to surpass Walmart by 2025 due to the growth of e-commerce sales in recent years. Walmart can close the e-commerce market share gap by utilizing their supercenter locations to offer same-day shipping specifically in the online grocery space. You see how that all flows together? It's a very clear narrative, and it's very much here is one piece of information, here's how it flows into the next piece of information, and here's how this flows into the next piece of information. And it maintains a flow that is very logical to the viewer. A good practice before starting building out a deck is just go through the deck without any information on it at all and just write out all the lead lines and then read out all the lead lines to see how the deck flows and to see if it is conveying the message that you want it to convey. Okay, now we're going to get into the more granular mechanics of slides and how to build out an individual slide. So most slides are divided into three main areas. A slide will have a lead line and up on top. Then it'll have some kind of graphic which supports whatever the lead line says. And the graphic's purpose is at quick glance represents or demonstrates what the lead line is trying to say. And then key takeaway section for more detail to be provided on either the graphic or the information that the lead line has. In addition to, you'll usually also have a footer at the bottom of the slide. So if you look at this slide, for instance, I have right up here, this is my lead line. It tells what the main message of the slide is. Then I look over here. Here is a graphic, basically giving a visual representation of what my lead line is saying. And then if I look over here, this is my key takeaway area. And this side goes into more detail on specifics. So for instance, if I wanted to know more about what should be in key takeaways, I could read this section right here. Not all slides are structured this way. Sometimes you'll have a really big chart and a single graphic will take up an entire slide. Other times it'll be so information heavy that you'll just have a key takeaway section. But on the most part, this is a very good style to use for the majority of your slides. This is a slide that was made publicly available on the internet for training purposes, and look how it follows this format. It has the lead line right here, then it has a chart that backs up what the lead line is trying to say, then it has this key takeaways area that will go into more depth about what this graphic is trying to display. And finally, if you want to get footnotes or sources, you can look in the footer and get that information. I encourage you as you look at different slides or presentations, whether throughout school or in your careers, try to identify the different elements of each slide. Next up is alignment. Alignment is probably one of the most important visual principles in making a slide look professional. If you're able to nail alignment, your slides will look fantastic. Alignment creates visual harmony among elements within a slide while also being able to convey importance and ordering of content. At its basics, what alignment is essentially it divides space into some kind of grid. And then as you go ahead and you distribute elements into a space, you make sure that all of those elements fit within inside that grid. That way everything looks like it's together and it looks like that content is equally distributed throughout the slide. Now, I think one of the best places to look for alignment outside of just slides is go to different websites. You'll notice that websites will use alignment to be able to create visual appeal. In slides, specifically what I do, before I build any slide, I'll always figure out what is the smallest element I will use on a slide, and then I'll divide that slide up into equally sized columns. And then what I'll do is I'll make sure that all my elements fit within these columns. I can have an element that spans multiple columns. However, it needs to be able to fit within this column. For instance, the slide that we're looking at right now, my smallest element on this slide is this text over here, and it has a width about this much. So because of that, I would divide this slide into 3 different columns. I have a column here, I have a column here, I have a column here. And so this slide right here has 3 different columns, and then I'll distribute content accordingly. I want my graphic has more importance than the key takeaways over here. So I'm going to give this graphic 2 columns worth of space on this slide, where my key takeaways only have 1 column's worth of space on this slide. Here's another slide that I found online that is available for training purposes. And look at how the alignment works in this slide. You can see that this slide is divided into basically 4 different possible content areas. Then you see it has 3 different elements in it. This perception element, this car buying element, and this mobility element. You see that perception and mobility are only given 1 column. However, carbine is given 2 columns. This entails that carbine is probably a little bit more important, but there's still a order that is being followed through this slide. For me, figuring out how to master alignment was a huge game changer in my ability to build out professional looking slides. And I highly recommend that you take the time to invest in being able to build out alignment. In addition, as this presentation continues, I encourage you to look and try to discern the alignment of each one of the slides that I've built out. Every single one of my slides follows this alignment principle. So when you get to a slide, I want you to try to figure out how many content areas or columns am I using for that slide. And lastly, order. Order is important because you want to know where the eyes of your viewers will go during the presentation, so you know what they're going to look at first and where to put the most critical information and in those areas that they're going to look first, so you can follow the pyramid principle. Typically, the reader's eyes will start up at this top left corner, and then they'll go from left to right, and then they'll move down, just like if you're reading a book. So on this slide, for instance, eyes will naturally first look at what is up here. They'll start over in this left corner and then move from the left top corner to the right top corner. Then they'll move down to the left section and then move from left to right and so on. So just having a general understanding of this is important, just so you can help know where the viewer's eyes will go, and better be able to help guide them through your message. Also, keeping in the challenge I gave from the previous slide, if you look at this slide right here, you see there's a content area here, there's a content area here. So this slide would only require 2 columns to be able to make. However, this slide, you see this content area is about half the size of this content area, though this slide at large required 3 columns to create. Okay, now moving more into some of the more granular mechanics of a slide, such as color. Color is really important. It's important that you set up and establish a color palette and that you are consistent in using this color palette throughout your entire deck. Now, colors are powerful because they can signal different information. I suggest when making a color palette, start off by first choosing a primary color. Then after that, have a secondary color that is similar to your primary color. And then choose a third color that's on the opposite side of the color wheel that you can use for showing differentiation or callouts. And then additionally, if you have more time, try to add a couple other differentiating colors, but don't add any more than three. Otherwise, it gets too confusing with colors. Mostly, you'll be just using these three colors throughout your deck. And if you notice through this deck, you'll see that these are the three main colors I use. Only in special cases, like this case for instance, do I call on another color because I need the color to be able to show more information. When choosing a primary color, know that this color you're going to be using most often, and it's usually best practice to choose the primary color that is similar to the colors of the organization that you're working for. For instance, this deck I am making for Brigham Young University's strategy department, and in the past, the strategy program has used this color for a lot of their material, so I've decided to choose that as my primary color. I then made a variant of that color and I got this more tealish color, and I also used that as my secondary color. And you see these two colors complement each other well. Finally, I chose this gold color as a way to be able, as a differentiated color, because this golden color really stands out from these other two. And then these colors also, when need be, I draw on for certain purposes, such as, for instance, showing that linking other colors over here to this part of the graphic. In addition to choosing a color palette, it's also important to choose a font family with sizes and keep those consistent throughout your deck. There are three main different types of fonts: sans serif, serif, and monospaced. The biggest difference between sans serif and serif is that serif fonts have these little tails on the end of text edges so that it is easier to be able to read them when they're small. However, for slide decks, you generally never want to have text that small. So for most cases, I would recommend sticking with a sans serif font for most of your text, just because they're very simple, easy to read, and very clear. Normally, with serif fonts, I have usually seen, when I have seen them used, it's usually either to add some kind of style to the deck. For instance, having a title. Some decks, their formats is their titles will be in serif. Or, for instance, in my decks, I like to use serif fonts to highlight that I am taking a direct quote. So monospaced is a little bit different. What makes monospaced unique is each character is the exact same width. So that way everything lines up with each other. Monospaced fonts are most commonly used in programming languages and in shells or terminals. So I like to use monospaced fonts rarely, only in the cases where I am demonstrating or showing code on a slide. So when you see a monospace font on one of my slides, you would know that I am showing you a piece of code. Now there's a couple different, there are a wide variety of different fonts you can use. I recommend sticking with these 5 different fonts that I laid out. If you're going for a sans serif font, either choose between Arial and Helvetica. You can hardly tell the difference between these fonts. I think the uppercase R in Helvetica is different, and if you notice on the A's, the tail here is a little bit different. But besides that, I don't think there's really too much difference. I prefer to stick with Arial just because it's very simple, it's very clean, and it works on just about any machine. However, if you want to do something a little bit different and still be professional, I recommend doing Helvetica. Times New Roman is a classic. I use it all the time for direct quotes. Um, but Georgia, I hope I'm not pronouncing that incorrectly, um, adds a little bit more of a style flair onto it. I highly recommend using this font for titles. And then Curio New is my favorite monospace font and is probably one of the most ubiquitous monospaced fonts out there. Lead line size, try to keep it between size 26 and 22 because with the lead line, you want it to be big and you want it to catch the attention of the viewer, but you also want to keep it small enough so you can fit information on the slide. A choice I think you should make is choosing, do you want to have two lines or one line? I like to have two lines. Usually you'll have to be under 26 if you want two lines. However, maybe you want to give a more concise title and then a subheader under it, so it's perfectly acceptable. And I've seen this happen before. Do something like a title that's size 26 and then have like a subheader that's 22. But try not to go above 26 on your lead lines or below 22. Now for body text, for titles, I like to keep them either at 20 or 18, depending on the other text, 20 on the bigger side and 18 on the smaller side. For body text on the bigger side, I usually will never go above 18 for body text. My default is actually at 16. Then I'll use 14 when I need the text to be a little bit smaller, but I'll never go lower than 12. The only time you really should ever go smaller than 12 is if you have a footnote or something down at the bottom. If you are typing and your text is, you find that you need to make your text smaller than 12, I highly recommend going back through the text that you're typing and try to make it more concise or rearrange things because once you get under 12, it gets very difficult for viewers to be able to read. But general takeaway for body text, try to keep it between 18 and 12, and then titles, keep it at 20 or 18. Really try to separate the body text from the lead line. That's very important. Okay, on this slide, I am showing the measurements that I personally use to create my own personal slide templates when I'm creating slides. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because I am going to be doing a separate video on how to make a slide template from scratch, and I'll be using these measurements. So I'll be talking more about this in that video. Additionally, this slide is just like the last slide. It's providing more measurements. Only in this slide, it's showing how to create different size content areas so that when we go through and create a template together, we can have horizontal alignment and built into our slide template. Okay, in this next section, we're going to be going over professionalism, where I'm going to share some general tips on how to make slides, going over some best practices and things to avoid. Now, before we get into this section, I'd just like to state that slide deck making is an art. And like any art, there are rules that you need to follow. However, these rules can be broken. Now, before you go ahead and break these rules, I highly encourage you to practice out these rules and get a good understanding of why these rules are in place before you go ahead and break them. In addition to that, I would also like to say that the standards I'm going over in the next couple of slides are very high, and I don't even manage to make these standards consistently myself. I really try with all my slides to be able to adhere to these standards, but sometimes I do fall short as well. So know that if you do struggle to live up to all these standards on your slides, you're totally okay. This is more of a target that you should aim for than necessarily the bare minimum bar that you need to hit. So with any slide structure, try to use a balance of both graphics and text, and make sure that the graphics are contributing to the message. Oftentimes, it's very easy to get caught up in one or the other, but remember that your whole point of your slide is to try to convey your key message to an audience in a way that is most easy for them to be able to digest. So I have these three slides up here as examples. You look at this first slide, it has a lead line, and then it has this graphic here. This is a very nice professional picture that is taken. It's of a bunch of pyramids. However, despite it looking professional, this picture really does not contribute that much to the slide. And really this slide is more of what you'd see in more of a narrative deck rather than a stakeholder deck. You go on to this next slide. This slide also has a lead line, but it just has text. Now, there's a lot of really good information on this slide, and it really does explain well what the pyramid principle is. However, with first glance at this slide, it is very hard to take away a key message and to be able to digest all this information at once. For a reader to do that, they will need to go through and read everything in order to get a grasp on that. And you also want to avoid making your viewer do that. Now, I will say I have seen these slides in professional practice before, and sometimes these slides are necessary evils because there's just no other way to convey all this information. But really try, if you do have a slide like this, at least break it up into, or at least add some graphics into it. You'll see on the next couple of slides, I have information that is in this kind of format, but I use graphics to break it up to make it easier for the reader to be able to take everything in. And I'll point that out on the next slide. Ideally, you want all your slides to look like this. This very this graphic supports the lead line. It has a lot of information in it, but it's also very simple and very quick to grasp, and there is text to support this graphic. So the big takeaway is while all these slides do look professional, and I would say they are acceptable, try to make slides that look like this one. In general, one type of slide that I did not put up here because I feel like I do not have the expertise to comment on is sometimes you'll see a slide that has text taking up half of it and then a graphic like this taking up the other half of it. The reason why I'm not commenting on whether or not you should use that slide or not is because I have seen them used in professional practice before. And so I'm not in a position to say whether or not they would be acceptable. Um, my thoughts though on a slide like that is always try to have a graphic that is informational. However, these graphics can take time to make. So if you are on a crunch and you need to get something out, it could be better to say take all this text, put it into this column, and then take this picture and put it there. But like I said before, this is all of art and it takes practice to figure out what feels right. Now, I mentioned how the next slide I will have has a lot of information like this. And so I'd like to show you how I organize that information into a way that's more graphically appealing. Before we dive into this slide, I'd just like to show that in this slide, I could have easily just had it as one big blob of text right here because I do have a lot of information. I have 5 different categories that I want to talk about, and each one of them have 2 to 3 bullet points each. However, rather than just displaying this as a slide of just text, I decided to split them into 5 different columns and then place a graphic above each one of them so it is easier for the viewer to be able to take in the information. And you notice that each one of these graphics relates to the text, so it makes it a little bit easier for the reader just at a glance to know what this slide is talking about. But moving on to the content of this slide, um, some of my best practices are using icons, bold colored text, callouts, running agendas, and the align tool are great ways to be able to make effective slides and to make them easy to follow and to convey information well. Icons are great for giving simple visual cues or representation. um, if I didn't have other graphics in the slide, I could have easily just put an icon for each, and that would give the viewer a visual callback to what this information is going, and kind of provides a little bit of a visual summary of what the information down here would be going over. Bold and colored text is great for highlighting specific information within blobs of text. If you've noticed on other slides, I've used bold information specifically in very text-heavy areas to highlight details that the reader might find interesting. Also, what's nice about using colored text is if you color the text, you can actually link it to other elements on the slide. For instance, if I had something else that was blue, if I had a graphic that was blue, I can show that this word here corresponds with that graphic. Callouts are great because they allowed you to provide more detail or call attention to specific areas of the slide. And they're just really great for when you want to show something or you want to explain something in more depth at a specific location, but you really don't know how to. Use a call out. They get the viewer's attention. They're great for providing small detail in certain places. One of the biggest use cases I feel for call outs is especially on graphics. You can point to an individual location on a graphic to explain it. Running agendas are wonderful because they help the viewer know where they are in the deck. I personally like to have an agenda and then bring it back up every single section to show the viewer where it is. That's one way to do it. I know other people or other decks I've seen, what they'll do is they might put like icons down here, or they might put a subheader here or a subheader over here that just shows where we are in the deck, and that way that the viewer can know at all times, just have a general sense of where they are in the presentation so they don't get lost. I honestly would love to have a call out to where we are in the presentation on my slides, but I've consciously chosen not to because they take up real estate, because I would have to give up area to do so. However, I will say in some of my other decks that I do use this template format for, I will have a subheader here, but that's usually only if I have a section that's very large and I don't want the viewer to get lost. For this section though, everything falls into either really best practices or things not to avoid, so hopefully it's not too hard on the viewer to know where they are. And finally, the align tool. This is a huge game changer because it allows you to create alignment very quickly among objects. What you'll do is you'll highlight a bunch of objects, say like I highlight these 5 objects here, then I want to distribute them equally. I'd press distribute horizontally, and then it would format these objects so they are perfectly spaced and aligned. For my presentation. Also, if you have a hard time finding it, this is a great shortcut to memorize Alt-JD or JP, depending on if it's an object or a picture, then AA, then V or H, depending if you want to distribute it horizontally or vertically. Okay, these are the biggest do nots when creating a slide deck. And really, I think if I were to summarize this in one word, I would say default. Do not use default. Do not use default templates. Do not use default colors, and don't use default clip art. So for templates, if you look at any of these templates, they should be very familiar to you. I'm sure you've all seen at least one of these templates used. Default templates are very overused, they're very unprofessional. If a viewer sees a default template, immediately they know how you created the slide, and it just gives a sense of, it almost sends the message that a slide was put together at the last minute. It doesn't come off as very professional. If you think about it, if a company is paying you millions and millions of dollars to build out a slide deck and you turn in something that looks like it could be done overnight, the message you're sending to them right off the bat is they basically have wasted an investment on you, because what you're delivering to them was literally something they could have made on their own. Same goes for colors. We all know these colors. We all know this font. We've seen this all the time whenever we open up a word processor, Excel, whole anything, we see this. And it also, like the default fonts, just screams unprofessional. It's very simple. Just create your own custom palette or swap to Arial or Helvetica. It's a very easy fix. And finally, clip art and watermarks. Now, if you've seen this, I'm sure you guys have seen this type of clip art before in presentations. It just also comes across as very unprofessional. It's it demonstrates that you don't really know what to do with the area. It can be distracting. Sometimes it can come off as looking silly. Remember, graphics should contribute to the lead line and they should help support whatever the lead line is saying. More often than not, these clip art is way too generic um, to be able to really support a slide. So I just recommend avoiding it. And also, never have a watermarked photo. If you have a watermark on your photo, it also looks very unprofessional. Remedies for each one of these: make your own templates. It goes a long way. It'll save you a lot of time. Swap the default colors and the default fonts right off the bat. And instead of using clip art, at worst, use at least vectors or icons. They look a lot more professional than clip art. Create custom graphics and use professional images instead. Okay, so these are things that you not necessarily should never do. However, I highly recommend that you avoid doing or using these. Number one, don't use Google Slides or Canva. PowerPoint is a professional tool. It has a lot more superior features such as measurement snapping, alignment, advanced graphs, and slide master that allow you to create more professional looking slides. It also does allow for online collaboration through OneDrive, so you can work with other people on it, just like with Google Slides. I will say though that Google Slides is constantly innovating and they are making updates. So slides may one day get to a point where PowerPoint is. However, realize that slides is made for a very broad audience. It's made for students. It's made for just anybody that quickly wants to put together a slideshow presentation, where PowerPoint is more specifically geared towards a professional or a professional user. So if you're making something professional, I highly recommend use PowerPoint to do it. And Canva is more often than not just overly aesthetic. I've judged decks before for case competitions, and more often than not, those decks that use Canva don't end up doing too well because they usually look way too aesthetical and they lack that analytical rigor that is required for most slide decks. And it's oftentimes harder to get on the same level as graph making that PowerPoint or even Google Slides can do. Next, pie charts. If you've taken a statistics course, you know never to use pie charts. The simple explanation for this is it's very hard to distinguish different sizes between in pie charts. Like for instance, it's hard to tell which is bigger, this purple area or this green area. Always better to use a stacked bar chart just because the human eye is able to discern lengths better than it is to discern radians. Um, Exceptions to this, I would say, number one, if the client asks for a pie chart, give them a pie chart. That's pretty obvious. But also in addition, another use case for pie charts um, or just spherical or circular charts in general. I like to use them on KPIs when I'm making a dashboard if I am showing a single number. Say like I'm showing, I don't know how many users what percent of user increase we had last quarter. I'm showing that number right here. I might have a donut chart around it just to help represent the number, and that gives a little bit more of a graphical representation of the number. But besides that, in general, try to avoid any circular charts. Next, smart art. Let's now Smart art, I actually use a lot of smart art in my in the slides. In this deck, I've actually on several slides I use smart art. However, what I do, I never end with smart art. I'll always start with smart art as a base, and then what I'll do is I'll right click, I'll convert smart art to objects, and then I'll manipulate those objects to better serve the purpose that I'm doing. So if you want to create graphics, I recommend starting off with using Smart Art as a base, but never leave it with default Smart Art. Default Smart Art is a little bit overused and can come off as a little bit generic. When using Smart Art though, what I like to use for starting out mostly are as processes and hierarchy charts. And then I like to build off from there. Finally, animation. Now, animation you got to be very careful with. Using too much animation is distracting and it does come across as unprofessional. I highly recommend keeping animation to a minimal. If you are going to use animation, try to only use either appears or fades and don't do anything too exuberant. Remember that if a slide deck is printed off, you should be able to take the printed slide deck and hand it to somebody, and they should be able to still get all the information they need just by looking at it. Or a slide deck should always be able to be converted to a PDF. So it's always safe not to use animation. If you do use animation, keep it really simple. Okay, finally, I'd like to introduce you to some PowerPoint add-ons that are used in the industry, both Efficient Elements and Mecha Graphics. Efficient Elements is great for quickly creating out different slides. They have a lot of templates and they have a lot of good tools for being able to create alignment and just formatting objects together. As you can see here, they really do expand on alignment tools. Mecha Graphics is great for making very advanced charts. If you want to go next level with more professional charts, Mecha is the way to go. Um, myself, for personal presentations that I'm doing outside of a corporation, like this one that I'm making, I like to stay away from these add-ons just because they can get expensive. And I'll also point out that I do feel like it's very important to have a good base level of PowerPoint without any add-ons because I know a lot of ex-consultants who come out of the industry and they move on. They're working at a big, large consulting firm that has all of these great PowerPoint add-ons that make their life easier. They become very accustomed to those add-ons. Then they exit the industry. They go and start working for a private equity firm, or they work in corporate strategy into a corporation that doesn't have all those add-ons, and all of a sudden it is much harder for them to make PowerPoints because they are so reliant on those proprietary add-ons that their firms previous had. So explore the add-ons if you are looking to start a company, and slide decks is one of your main core competencies. It might be worth investing in one of these. Otherwise, though, if you're just doing it for personal use or if your company doesn't have it, no need to bother with them. And finally, Analyst Academy and Firm Learning are both great YouTube channels if you want to go into more depth on how to create effective slides. I've personally used both of these channels to learn how to build slides for myself. They both have really great content. I know the Analyst Academy, for instance, they actually partner up with organizations and they teach people in organizations, how to create professional slide decks. So they have a lot of credibility here. Also, Firm Learning, it's taught by an ex-McKinsey consultant, and he goes through how to make management consulting style slide decks. So if you are interested in learning more about slide creation, I recommend checking out their channels. Okay, so in this next section, we are going to go over advanced graphs. As previously mentioned, I believe that the ability to create advanced graphs is one of the reasons why you should use PowerPoint instead of using Google Slides or using Canva. In addition, I'm going to be making a separate video about how to create each one of these plots, so look out for that as well. So over the next couple of slides, I am going to be going over how to make each one of these graphs in PowerPoint. I'm just going to be giving a brief overview of what the graph is and the basic setup of how to get it started. These are all graphs that I have used before, and I found them to be very useful, and I think that they'll be of benefit for you to know how to make. It should also be noted that each one of these graphs will be made with base PowerPoint and will not require any add-ons to create. Okay, so on this slide, we're going to go over how to make a custom regression plot. Custom regression plots are great for showing advanced relationships between two quantitative variables on a scatter plot. Now, both Excel and PowerPoint do have trendline features that make simple regressions for you. However, what's nice about a plot like this is it gives you full control over what your regression function looks like, and you can do custom regressions like this logistical regression. So let's first take a look at this graph right here. We see some of the elements of it are, we have these data points, then we have this regression trend line, and then we have this vertical threshold line. So the way we're going to do this is what our data will look like. We'll have first in the primary column, we'll have in the first column, we'll have all of the X values that represents these points right here. Then what we're going to do is we're going to have their corresponding, we'll have the corresponding Y values for each X value that we have, and that will give us the data points. So moving on to the curve, what we want to do is we want to generate some data on the x-axis, whatever the minimum to the maximum is. For this graph, I did from 0 to 10. I did incrementing steps of 0.5, and I plotted that here. Then I have my logistic function, which takes in the x value and then gives me what the y value would be, so I can create this nice logistics curve. Finally, to get this vertical line, all what I do is I set 2 points, one on the x-axis that are the same, and I set one of their y's to be 0 and the other one to be 1, and this gives me this vertical line. And what's great about setting up a graph like this and putting in a vertical line here is I can resize this graph and this vertical line will move. So I don't have to manually move it every time that I want to resize or modify this graph. Okay, so next we'll be going over variance line graphs. These are also a quantitative to quantitative relationary graph. However, variance graphs excel when you have multiple y values per each X value. This is great for anything from time series forecasting to NPS scores over time to basic surveys. The whole purpose of this graph is so you can be able to see this spread right here. So kind of the way you'd interpret this graph of specifically, I have my solid line, and that is the known data. Then I have this forecasted line that shows what the forecast is going to be over the unknown period. I have that dotted. And then I have this spread here that shows the second quartile, that shows the first quartile and the third quartile of the data of whatever I see that spread coming out to be. So let's start. To make this graph, first you want your horizontal x-axis. For this graph, I have dates. Then I'm going to have my y-actuals, where I plot in all the information that I know, and I'm going to keep that line a solid. Then I'm going to make my forecasted line, which is similar to the previous graph. I will just take whatever regression function I'm using, plug in the date into that regression function, and that'll give me what my expected y value is. And then I'm going to make that a dotted line. Now here is where things get a little bit more complicated and tricky. So I'm going to use a combined graph, a combo graph function. And so for these three columns, they're all going to be line graphs. However, for these next columns, I'm going to have them be area graphs and stacked area graphs, and they are going to be on the primary axis. So what I am doing is this column represents an area right here, and then this column over here represents an area stacked on top of this area. Now this area, you cannot see it because I made the fill clear or completely transparent. So all that I get is this stacked area, is this second area right here, and this ultimately shows me what the spread is going to be. And simply to calculate the spread, you take whatever the deviation is and you subtract it from your function, and what that will do is it will give you the difference between wherever your expected is and wherever the first standard deviation of your data is. So it will build a stacked area up to here. Then on your second stacked area, now this time you only want to have, you want it to be basically the width of this line, which is going to be the function minus the deviation plus another deviation. So really this is just two standard deviations of width. So I'm going to set this stacked area to be two standard deviations, and that's how I get this spread here. And oftentimes I like to make this area transparent so that it doesn't engulf the forecasted projected line. I absolutely love doing horizontal box plots, also known as side box plots, simply because they're just a great way how to show survey response data. Um, PowerPoint and Excel do have a box and whiskers plot that shows this data vertically. However, I like to use this style more because one, using the box and whisker plot is a little bit unintuitive the way they have it set up in PowerPoint. This gives me a little bit more control over the data. And two, I like having these to be horizontal because then if I want to have a question, I can take up more horizontal room to display what the question was. But this is really good if you have sent out a survey, you have NPS scores. This is a great way how to compare the variance of NPS scores on a survey or on a graph. Just really quick, so the relationship between this graph is you have quantitative on the x-axis and you have qualitative on the y-axis. To go ahead and set this graph up, I'm going to briefly explain the structure of this graph before getting into the data over here. So what this essentially is just a bunch of stacked bar charts. However, this first bar is clear. So because this first bar is clear, as you can see here, it makes the second stacked bar and the third stacked bar look as if they're floating in the air to get that box plot. So for these first four columns in our data, the first column is going to be whatever the question is. Then the second column is going to be our first quartile. So that is going to draw a bar from here to here, whatever that may be. Then for our third column, that we want to get the mean. And what we want to do is draw a second stacked bar from here to here. So we're going to take the difference between the mean and the first quartile, and that's going to get us the second stacked bar. Finally, to get the third stacked bar, we're going to do a similar thing where we just want the difference between the mean and the third quartile. And to do that, we are just going to take the difference between the third quartile and the mean, and that will get us the second stacked bar. So we're going to make this first bar clear, and then we're going to outline these two bars so then we can clearly see where the mean is. And you don't have to do this as the mean. You can also do this as the medium if you prefer, whatever works best for you. Now, moving on to these error bars. So this is where things get a little bit tricky. We're going to make three other columns. We're going to have a max column, a min column, and then a zero column. This max column is going to represent whatever the maximum is of our data. This min column is going to represent where the minimum of our data is. And then this zero is just a placeholder. So to do this, if you right click on this graph, there'll be a drop down that comes over here that says error bars. You're going to click on that, and then you're going to right click on the error bar, and it's going to say format error bar. You're going to come over here, and then you'll be able to put in custom measurements for the error bars. You will enter in the max quartile. You'll enter in the difference between, for the max, the difference between the max point and the third quartile as the maximum, and then zero as the minimum. What they'll do is they'll draw a bar from here to here, and then you'll do the same process for the minimum bar, only instead you're setting the max to be the difference between quartile 1 and whatever the minimum value is, and then you're setting the positive error to be 0, so it comes off as right here. And that is how you make a side box plot in PowerPoint. Okay, so lastly, we are going to be going over Marimekko charts. Well, Marimekko charts are absolutely fantastic charts because what a Marimekko chart does, it gives you three variables to work with when you really only have two. What a Marimekko chart does is it allows you to use both a height axis and a width axis on top of a color axis. So this is great for, say, like market share, because I can quickly see the different amount of market share that each one of these firms has in different segments, while also getting an idea of who has the most market share as a whole. Now, these graphs are so popular that a lot of companies will pay for expensive plugins like Mekko Graphics that I showed earlier, just so they can make these graphs. So knowing how to make a graph like this in base PowerPoint gives you a lot of power in your analytical storytelling ability, just because how popular these graphs are, as well as how difficult they are to make. Now, I'm not going to be able to do justice in this lecture, but for this the structure of this graph, but I will give a brief overview of it. Essentially, you are going to have to start with data that looks like this. You can get this data pretty easily by putting it into a pivot table. Once you get data into this format, you're then going to have to translate it to this format. What I'm going to do is for each segment, I'm going to make 3 different entries, a minimum entry, a max entry, and then a midpoint entry. The reason for this is I need to tell Excel or PowerPoint where to start drawing this and where to end drawing this. So I would start out with my first segment at 0, then with the max entry being whatever percent it is, so it takes up that full percent. Then for my next entry, I'm going to start it wherever the previous percent started off. So since this segment ended at 48%, I'm going to tell the next segment to start out at 48%. And then I'm going to take whatever that segment's width is. You see here it's 43%, and I'm going to add that on to this 48%, and that's going to come out to the 92%. And I'm going to continue doing that so I can get width for each one of my different segments. The reason why I have a midpoint in here, this is purely so when I go to add data labels, I get data labels that are centered. Otherwise, I just get data labels on the ends, which I do not want. However, if you don't care about having data labels, you do not need to add um, this second row into it. You're going to use a stacked area chart to make this, and then once you have a stacked area chart, you are going to convert the axis to a date axis. This will change it from being, this will make the lines drop, this will give it the block format that you see rather than more of a mountain format that's standard with stacked areas. And it's going to be important that you convert the dates to this date range here. This gives you 100 days, so therefore you have 100% that you are showing. But that, and then finally, you're going to have this other column that is going to be you're going to make a combo graph, and then you're going to add a scatter plot into it with vertical lines. You're going to add one vertical line here and then one vertical line here, and this way you can fully separate all the different blocks from each other, so you get a nice clean layout like this. And we're going to do that in the same way that we did it with the custom regression, where we're going to take 2 points here, set one of them to 0, set the other one to 100%. That draws a line from here to here, and then same with the point from here to here. But that wraps up this slide. I hope that all this information is useful and that you are able to use it throughout both your academic and professional careers.